There is a moment in life, often subtle and without fanfare, when something within you begins to shift. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with lightning bolts or a sudden awakening. No, it creeps in softly, like the quiet bloom of dawn, unnoticed at first but impossible to ignore once seen. It's the moment you realize that what you've been carrying is no longer yours to hold, that the weight you've worn so long as skin is simply residue, stories that don't belong to you, expectations inherited from the voices around you, identities stitched into your soul by fear and habit rather than truth. And so begins the quiet revolution, the return to yourself. You wake up one morning and the world doesn't feel quite the same. The coffee still brews. The light still spills across your floor the way it always has. But something inside is different. There's a stillness where once there was noise, a curiosity where there was once panic. It doesn't mean the pain is gone. It means your relationship to it has changed. You stop running. You stop searching for the next thing that might make it all make sense. Instead, you sit, you breathe. You begin to listen, not to the outside voices that once shaped you, but to the quiet one within, the one that always whispered but never shouted. You remember the years you spent chasing approval, chasing affection, chasing versions of yourself that looked good on paper, but felt hollow in your bones. You remember how hard you tried to be what the world wanted you to be, how you sculpted yourself to fit into molds too small for your spirit, how often you betrayed your own intuition just to feel safe in someone else's narrative. And yet, even then, there was something inside you that never gave up, a flicker, a pulse, a sacred ache that whispered, "There's more. This isn't it. Keep going." You didn't understand it then, but you followed it, and that made all the difference. You begin to see the beauty in all that broke you, not because the pain was beautiful, but because you were. Because even in your worst moments, you loved. You tried, you showed up. Even when the world didn't, you held on. And now as you look back, you don't see failure. You see resilience. You see the girl who kept believing, even when belief felt dangerous. You see the boy who cried in silence because he didn't know where to place his sorrow. You see the person who stood in the ruins and still reached toward the light. And that is not weakness. That is grace. There comes a point when you stop measuring healing by how good you feel and start measuring it by how honest you're willing to be. You stop pretending you're okay when you're not. You stop dressing your wounds in distractions. You stop filling the silence with noise. Instead, you enter it. You let it echo. You let the emptiness speak. And in that space, something sacred rises. Not answers, not solutions, just truth. The kind of truth that doesn't need to be understood to be real. The kind that lives in your breath, in your tears, in your willingness to stay. You start to unlearn. You unlearn the belief that love must be earned. You unlearn the habit of apologizing for your existence. You unlearn the patterns that kept you stuck in cycles of self-betrayal. You unlearn the roles you played to survive, and you meet the person you were before the world told you who to be. And as you peel back the layers, you don't find a mess. You find innocence. You find clarity. You find a self that is both ancient and brand new. A self that remembers who you are when you forget. A self that doesn't ask you to be better, just to be. You begin to live slower. You stop rushing to fill the spaces in your calendar. You stop measuring your worth by your productivity. You start honoring your body's rhythm. You sleep when you're tired. You eat when you're hungry. You breathe just to feel the breath move through you. You walk without purpose. You sit without distraction. You let the moment be enough, and in doing so, you begin to reclaim your time, not just on the clock, but in your soul. You stop being afraid of the empty space. You understand now that emptiness isn't lack. It's room. It's potential. It's the field where your truest self begins to bloom. You stop seeking validation from sources that never learned how to see you. You no longer shapeshift to fit into spaces that don't know how to hold your truth. You stop begging for love from hands that were never open. You stop asking for explanations from mouths that speak only in silence. You stop chasing what depletes you. Instead, you pause. You gather your energy. You ask, "What do I need?" And then, with trembling but unwavering grace, you give that to yourself. You begin to define your own success. It's no longer about the accolades or the applause. It's about how deeply you're willing to live, how present you are in your own story, how gently you hold yourself when everything falls apart, how bravely you show up when the world goes quiet. You celebrate the little things now, the way your chest rises without effort, the way your laughter returns without warning, the way your eyes find beauty in the mundane. You don't need fireworks. You don't need fanfare. You just need moments that feel like truth, that feel like home. You understand now that healing doesn't mean you'll never feel pain again. It means you won't abandon yourself when it comes. It means you know how to sit with your sorrow without letting it define you. It means you trust that every emotion has its place, its purpose. You no longer push away your grief. You no longer silence your rage. You no longer deny your fear. You invite them in. You let them stay as long as they need. You learn from them. And then, when they're ready, you let them go. Without judgment, without shame, with love. You stop trying to be light all the time. You stop believing that being spiritual means being untouched by darkness. You know now that light is not the absence of dark. It's what holds it, what transforms it, what walks with it. You become a container for both, for the joy and the ache, for the laughter and the longing. You hold your contradictions like poetry. You no longer need to be fixed. You need only to be felt. And when people ask, "How are you?" you stop saying, "I'm fine" by default. You tell the truth. Maybe not to everyone, but at least to yourself. You say, "I'm tender today. I'm tired but grateful. I'm healing." You stop performing stability. You let others see your humanness. And in doing so, you create permission for yourself and for them to be real, to be raw, to be enough, even in the becoming. This is the path home, not back to who you were, but forward to who you've always been underneath it all. It's not about becoming better. It's about becoming true, becoming whole, becoming free. And every step, no matter how faltering, is sacred. Every breath is a benediction. Every truth, even the uncomfortable ones, are invitations to come closer, to yourself, to others, to life. You are not late. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are right on time, exactly where you need to be. And all of this, the sorrow, the joy, the confusion, the clarity, is part of the journey back to you. There's something sacred about the way you begin to reclaim your own story. Not by rewriting it to fit someone else's narrative, not by deleting the parts that still make your voice shake when spoken aloud, but by choosing to hold every chapter with reverence. You no longer rush past the pain just to get to the parts that make you look resilient. You no longer cherry-pick the moments that are palatable for public eyes. You embrace all of it, the joy, the shame, the awkward beginnings, the relapses, the late-night tears, the quiet victories that no one else saw. It all matters, because it all made you. You've come to see that true growth doesn't always feel like growth. Sometimes it feels like crumbling, like sitting in your car too long after arriving home because you need a moment to breathe, like saying no to something that used to make you feel important because you finally realized it was draining you. Like ending a conversation that once validated you but now only confuses your spirit. Growth, you've learned, often shows up dressed like grief. And when it does, you meet it like an old companion. You no longer push it away. You make space for it. You give it room to teach you what comfort never could. You've grown softer with yourself. The voice in your head no longer yells, no longer demands perfection from your every move. It pauses now. It questions gently. It says, "You're trying." It reminds you that your efforts matter even if they don't always produce results. You begin to trust that your value is not conditional, that you don't have to prove yourself in every room, that you're allowed to exist without justification. And as that self-trust deepens, your life begins to shift. Not because the world around you changes, but because the world within you finally feels safe. There's a part of you that remembers how you used to abandon yourself, how you would say yes just to avoid confrontation, how you'd overextend your time, your kindness, your energy, hoping that someone would finally see you, would finally stay. But you see now that self-betrayal is a high cost to pay for love. You no longer sacrifice your boundaries for belonging. You no longer confuse availability with affection. You no longer shrink in the hopes of being held, because now you hold yourself. And in that self-holding, you discover a steadiness that no outside force can shake. You've stopped trying to fix people. You've stopped seeing their potential as more real than their presence. You don't fall in love with who they could be. You fall in love with who they are. And if who they are doesn't feel safe, you step away, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with clarity. With a knowing that it's not your job to save someone who doesn't want to be saved. You no longer confuse love with labor. You want peace now, mutuality, love that feels like home, not like a project. And until that arrives, you give that to yourself. You've also learned the power of stillness. You're no longer seduced by the constant need to move, to do, to hustle. You see now that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to rest, to sit with your feelings instead of numbing them, to stop reaching for your phone every time the silence becomes too loud, to watch your breath move in and out like waves and understand that this moment, this simple, present, unremarkable moment, is holy. You don't need to chase anything to be enough. You already are. Your relationship with time has softened. You don't rush as much. You stop saying, "I should be further by now," because you know that everyone blooms on their own clock. You trust divine timing, not as a concept, but as a reality you live. You let life unfold even when it moves slower than you'd like. You surrender the illusion of control. You let go of the timeline that once made you feel behind. And in that surrender, you discover the beauty of divine detours, the wisdom of pauses, the grace that comes when you stop running and start receiving. You start seeing people for who they are, not for what they give you. You don't hold people hostage to your expectations. You let them be human, flawed, inconsistent. And when their behavior hurts you, you name it, not to blame, but to understand. And if they cannot meet you in that understanding, you let them go. You don't force connection anymore. You don't beg for closure. You give yourself the clarity you need. You understand now that some people are chapters, not lifetimes. Lessons, not homes. And that doesn't mean the love wasn't real. It means the story had to move forward. You're more present with your own needs now. You don't wait until burnout to rest. You don't wait until you're sobbing to ask for help. You check in regularly. You tune into your body. You ask, "And what do I need today?" And you honor the answer. Sometimes it's movement. Sometimes it's solitude. Sometimes it's a call to someone who listens without trying to fix you. And whatever it is, you allow it. You stop pushing yourself beyond your limits just to be perceived as strong. You know now that honoring your limits is what makes you strong. You begin to understand grief not as something to get over, but as something to live with. You carry it gently now. You no longer rush your healing. You no longer resent the days when your heart feels heavy for no clear reason. You let the tears fall. You let the ache exist. You talk to your sadness like an old friend. You don't shame it. You don't silence it. You hold it close and say, "You're welcome here." Because you know now that grief is not something to be fixed. It is something to be felt. And feeling it fully is how you honor what was lost. Your faith has changed too. It's no longer built on fear. It's no longer about earning love or escaping punishment. Your faith is quieter now, deeper. It's in the way you surrender when you don't know what's next. It's in the way you trust that you're being guided, even when the path isn't clear. You don't need certainty anymore. You need presence. You need alignment. And your connection to the divine is no longer a performance. It's a relationship. It's real. It's raw. And it's enough. You allow yourself to begin again, every day, every hour, every moment. You stop waiting for the perfect starting point. You start where you are, with what you have. You don't need to wait until you feel ready. You know now that readiness comes in the doing. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to walk with it. So you begin, again and again and again. And each time it gets softer, stronger, more true. This version of you doesn't need to prove herself. She doesn't need to be perfect to be powerful. She doesn't chase what doesn't feel aligned. She doesn't settle for half love. She doesn't betray her gut to keep the peace. She honors her truth. She sits with her discomfort. She creates space for her own magic. And she doesn't do it for show. She does it because she finally understands that her wholeness was never lost. It was just buried. Under years of conditioning, under layers of pretending, under masks she wore to survive. But now she's done surviving. Now she lives. And maybe that's the most radical thing of all. To live, not for others, not for a timeline, not for applause, but for herself, for her own peace, for her own soul, for her own truth. There's a quiet kind of power in knowing that not everything broken needs to be fixed, that sometimes the cracks are where the light enters, that healing doesn't mean returning to the person you were before the pain. It means becoming someone entirely new because of it. And so you begin to let go of the urgency to be whole. You stop treating yourself like a project that needs constant renovation. You start treating yourself like a home that has weathered many storms and yet still stands. You stop obsessing over your broken parts. You start loving them, not because they're beautiful, but because they're yours, because they're honest, because they've carried you here. You remember now that survival once required you to suppress so much: your voice, your dreams, your intuition. You were taught to hide your needs in order to stay safe, to keep the peace, to be accepted. And maybe back then, that silence protected you, but now it only imprisons you. So you begin the slow, deliberate process of giving yourself back to yourself. You speak even when your voice trembles. You ask for what you need, even if your hands shake. You say no when it would be easier to say yes. You choose discomfort over self-abandonment. You show up, not as a polished version of yourself, but as the real thing. You've learned that bravery isn't always grand. It doesn't always look like standing in front of crowds or climbing mountains. Sometimes bravery is sending a text that says, "I need help." Sometimes it's walking away from someone you still love, because staying means betraying your peace. Sometimes it's taking a shower when your chest feels heavy. Sometimes it's getting out of bed and choosing to try again. You stop minimizing your courage. You stop calling your progress small. You begin to honor every tiny rebellion against the part of you that once believed you weren't enough. You no longer fight so hard to be seen. You don't twist yourself into something more acceptable just to be loved. You don't wear the mask of easygoing when your soul is screaming for depth. You don't nod in agreement when your gut says no. You stop seeking belonging by way of erasure. You belong to yourself now, and that belonging doesn't ask you to perform. It asks you to return, again and again and again, to the messy, complicated, radiant truth of who you are. There's a softness in you now that wasn't always there, not because you haven't faced darkness, but because you have, because you sat with it, because you let it teach you. You didn't let it harden you. You didn't build higher walls. You opened the windows. You let the storm pass through you, and now you're softer. Not because you're weaker, but because you're wiser. Because you know that gentleness is not passivity. It is a decision to remain tender in a world that celebrates numbness. It is the choice to heal, not just for yourself, but for everyone who'll sit in your presence and breathe a little easier because of it. You begin to notice how your intuition speaks in the smallest moments. The pause before saying yes, the knot in your stomach when you're out of alignment, the tension in your chest when someone's words don't match their energy. You used to ignore those signals. You used to override them with logic, with what made sense on paper, with what others told you was the right thing. But now you listen. You trust the feeling. You honor the wisdom that lives in your body, because your body remembers what your mind tries to forget. And you've come to realize that your intuition has never been wrong. It's only been quieted. You no longer romanticize chaos. You don't confuse emotional turbulence with depth. You don't chase the high of intensity. You want peace now, stability, reciprocity. You want conversations that don't drain you, love that doesn't confuse you, friendship that doesn't feel like a competition. You want presence, not performance. You no longer crave the excitement that comes from unavailability. You crave consistency, because you've seen what chaos costs, and you're no longer willing to pay with your spirit. You begin to treat your solitude as sacred. It's no longer a punishment. It's a sanctuary, a place where you return to hear your own thoughts, to remember your truth, to recharge from a world that often demands too much too quickly. You don't fill the silence with distractions. You let it speak. You let it hold you. You realize that loneliness isn't the absence of others. It's the absence of self. And the more you meet yourself in the quiet, the less alone you feel. You find companionship in your own company. You learn how to sit with yourself without needing to escape. Your love for life shifts. It becomes less about achieving and more about experiencing. Less about getting somewhere and more about being here. You stop waiting for vacations to rest. You stop saving joy for weekends. You integrate beauty into your everyday. A walk, a song, a deep breath, a sunset. You let the ordinary become extraordinary. Not because it changed, but because you did. Because your eyes now seek wonder. Because your heart now opens wider. You've learned to mourn what could have been without getting stuck in the longing. You stop torturing yourself with the what ifs. You understand that just because something had potential doesn't mean it had purpose. That not every love story is meant to last forever. That not every dream is meant to come true in the form you first imagined. You let yourself grieve. You let yourself remember, but you also let yourself move forward. You stop carrying ghosts. You make room for the living. You release the hope that kept you stuck. You step into the hope that invites your evolution. You're more mindful of how you speak now, not just to others, but to yourself. You catch the judgment, the harshness, the impatience, and you soften it. You replace "I'm such a mess" with "I'm doing my best." You replace "I'll never get it right" with "I'm still learning." You offer yourself the compassion you once gave so freely to others. You stop waiting for someone else to affirm your worth. You affirm it daily, quietly, intentionally. You build a new inner world, one where you are safe, one where you are loved, one where you are enough always. You've begun to see that the life you're creating isn't about avoiding discomfort. It's about building resilience. It's about knowing that you can fall and still get up, that you can fail and still be worthy, that you can be terrified and still choose to take the next step. You stop waiting for the fear to go away. You walk with it. You make room for it. You let it sit beside you, not at the head of the table. Because fear might always be part of the journey, but it no longer gets to lead. This chapter of your life isn't about changing everything. It's about changing how you relate to everything. It's about choosing alignment over approval, rest over hustle, depth over drama, truth over comfort. It's about remembering that you are allowed to outgrow people, places, and patterns. That you don't need a reason to evolve. That you don't owe anyone a version of yourself that you've healed beyond. You are coming home, not to a place, but to a feeling, a frequency, a remembering. You are returning to your center, to your essence, to the you that was never lost, only buried. And now, layer by layer, breath by breath, you are unearthing her, and she is radiant. There comes a moment when you stop looking at your life as a puzzle to be solved and begin to see it as a canvas to be painted. You stop asking, "How do I fix this?" and start asking, "How do I feel through this?" You become less obsessed with finding the right answers and more curious about asking the right questions. You stop searching for a finish line and start dancing with the rhythm of now. Because somewhere along the way, you realize life isn't a linear equation. It's poetry. It's not meant to be decoded. It's meant to be lived. You no longer look at your healing journey as a race against time. You stop panicking when old wounds resurface. You understand now that pain is cyclical, that healing is more like the tide than a straight climb. Sometimes it pulls you back, even as it's carrying you forward. You don't judge yourself for revisiting something you thought you'd already healed. You know now that each visit brings a new layer of understanding, a new depth of compassion, a new invitation to be gentler with yourself. And you accept that invitation again and again. You've begun to recognize the difference between healing and hiding. You used to confuse emotional bypassing with strength. You'd say, "It's fine, I'm over it," while your heart was still bleeding. You'd slap affirmations over fresh wounds and call it growth. But now you know better. Now you sit with the ache. Now you let it speak. Now you understand that true healing doesn't silence your pain, it listens to it. And in listening, you find freedom. Not from the pain itself, but from the shame wrapped around it. You stop pretending your scars don't exist. You start honoring the stories they tell. You've stopped using productivity to outrun your emotions. You no longer numb your discomfort with to-do lists. You've learned how to pause, how to slow down, how to create space for rest, not as a reward, but as a requirement. You no longer see rest as laziness. You see it as a rebellion, as a sacred refusal to let a world obsessed with performance dictate your worth. You rest to remember who you are beneath the doing. You rest to reconnect with your being, and in that being, you discover something profound. You were never meant to hustle for your peace. You were meant to remember it. You've changed the way you engage with pain. You no longer ask, how do I make this go away? You ask, what is this trying to teach me? You get curious. You ask your heartbreak what it's revealing about your boundaries. You ask your anxiety what it's trying to protect you from. You ask your triggers what they still need to be seen and soothed. You become an investigator of your own inner world, not to fix, but to understand, not to judge, but to witness. And in doing so, you turn your pain into a guide. You let it lead you to the parts of yourself still waiting to be met with compassion. You've become more intentional with your presence. You no longer say yes to things that drain you. You no longer force conversations that don't feel true. You stop overcommitting just to avoid disappointing others. You stop giving away pieces of yourself to people who don't respect the offering. You hold your energy sacred. You guard your time like the treasure it is. And you start asking yourself before every decision, does this honor me? If the answer isn't a full-body yes, you walk away. Without guilt, without explanation, with grace. Your idea of love has evolved. You no longer crave grand gestures. You crave consistency. You crave someone who shows up when it's inconvenient. Someone who listens not just to your words, but to your silences. Someone who doesn't need you to be perfect to stay. You've stopped seeking butterflies. You want peace. You want a love that feels like exhaling, like home, like safety. And until that love finds you in another, you give it to yourself daily, through how you talk to yourself, through how you protect your peace, through how you honor your own needs without waiting for permission. You no longer place your healing in someone else's hands. You understand now that no one can walk your path for you, that no one else can give you what you refuse to give yourself. You stop expecting others to complete you. You stop looking to relationships to heal your abandonment wounds. You stop outsourcing your sense of worth. You become your own home, your own healer, your own sanctuary. And the more you do that, the less you need from others. Not because you've shut down, but because you've learned how to fill your own cup first. You begin to embrace contradiction. You stop trying to be one thing all the time. You allow yourself to be sad and hopeful, to be afraid and courageous, to grieve and laugh in the same breath. You no longer demand consistency from your emotions. You let them flow like weather patterns, temporary, valid, natural. You stop judging yourself for being human. You stop labeling yourself based on your low days. You understand now that emotions are visitors, not definitions. They come, they go, and none of them take away your worth. You reconnect with your creative self, not to produce, but to play. You start writing again, not to be published, but to express. You dance again, not for an audience, but for your own joy. You let art back into your life as a form of nourishment, not as a metric. You create for the sake of creation, for the way it makes you feel, for the way it reminds you that you are alive. You stop needing your passions to be productive. You start letting them be healing. Be wild, be yours. You release the belief that healing is always comfortable. You stop expecting softness from every step of the journey. You embrace the discomfort as evidence that something important is shifting, that something is being released, rewritten, rewired. You no longer panic when the ground beneath you shakes. You know now that the shake is often the beginning of your becoming. That chaos isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's the clearing, the space being made for something truer to take root. You've become more aware of your breath, the way it moves through you, the way it changes when you're anxious, the way it grounds you when you return to it. You no longer take it for granted. You breathe intentionally, you pause, you feel, you let your breath lead you back to the present moment. And in that present moment, you find everything you were looking for. Not in the past, not in the future, but right here, right now, in this inhale, in this exhale. You've learned how to be alone without being lonely. You no longer see solitude as a space to fill. You see it as a space to expand, to return, to recalibrate. You spend time with yourself and actually enjoy it. You laugh at your own jokes. You take yourself on walks. You cook meals just for you. You write yourself love letters. You stop waiting for someone else to show you your own worth. You become your own greatest companion. And from that place, you attract connections that feel like additions, not lifelines. You stop asking life to be easy. You ask it to be real. You stop chasing comfort and start chasing alignment. You stop wishing things were different and start working with what is. You become an alchemist of your own experience. You turn wounds into wisdom. You turn endings into entrances. You turn pain into portals. You stop resisting the fire and start trusting that it's refining you. That what's burning away is only what you no longer need. That what remains is what was always meant to stay. This is the season of your return, not to the world, not to others, but to yourself, the self that knows, the self that remembers, the self that has waited patiently beneath the noise for you to finally come home. And now, you have. There's a new kind of silence in your life now. It doesn't scream like the loneliness you once knew, and it doesn't echo with absence like it used to when you lost people you thought would stay forever. This silence feels different. It's not empty, it's expansive. It doesn't demand anything from you. It simply invites you in, to sit, to breathe, to be. You find yourself seeking it more and more, not because you shut the world out, but because you finally found something within yourself worth listening to. You realize now that not all noise is connection, and not all company means companionship. Sometimes the most nourishing moments happen in stillness, in your own presence, where the only conversation is the one between your heart and your breath. You no longer carry the weight of being understood by everyone. There was a time you tried to explain yourself into acceptance. You broke yourself into smaller pieces so others could consume you without choking on your truth. You'd rewrite your feelings to fit the room. You'd dilute your fire to avoid burning too brightly, and you'd trade your boundaries for belonging. But now you let people misunderstand you. You don't chase down clarity for them. You no longer sacrifice your truth just to be palatable. If your presence disturbs the narrative they created about you, you let it. Because you're not here to be everyone's favorite chapter. You're here to be your own whole story. You start seeing growth in places you used to overlook. In the moments you choose silence instead of reacting. In the way you breathe through discomfort instead of escaping it. In how you walk away without drama when something doesn't serve you. You don't need grand breakthroughs to feel the shift anymore. You feel it in the everyday choices. In the way you speak to yourself with a little more patience. In how you don't spiral over a delayed message or an unanswered question. You feel it when you give yourself space to rest without guilt. When you say no without explanation. When you choose presence over performance. You no longer need your growth to be visible to everyone. It's enough that you feel it in your own body, your own spirit, your own peace. Your relationship with uncertainty has softened. You stop trying to control everything. You stop grasping at the future like a lifeline. You begin to sit in the unknown with a new kind of grace. You realize that most of life is lived in the waiting rooms, between decisions, between seasons, between who you were and who you're becoming. And instead of resenting those spaces, you lean into them. You find beauty in the not knowing. You find strength in the surrender. You no longer need every step to be mapped out. You trust that the ground will meet your feet as you move forward. You also start to trust people in a different way. Not blindly, not because they say all the right things, but because they show up consistently. You stop being impressed by intensity. You look for steadiness. You notice how they hold your silence, how they respond to your truth, how they treat you when you're not performing. You no longer open your heart to everyone. You don't have walls, but you have doors. And not everyone gets the key. Because your heart is no longer a place to visit. It's a home. And homes deserve care, respect, and reverence. You begin to grieve differently too. You don't rush it. You don't shame it. You let it wash over you in waves. You stop judging yourself for missing people who hurt you. You stop editing your memories to make the pain easier to swallow. You allow the grief to be messy, to be non-linear, to come and go as it pleases. You understand now that grief isn't something to get over. It's something to carry with grace. You learn to live with the empty spaces. You decorate them with compassion. You breathe into them without needing to fill them. And slowly they stop feeling like wounds. They start to feel like sacred reminders of all you dared to love. You start reconnecting with your body in a way that's more about listening than controlling. You stop punishing it for not looking like an ideal. You stop treating it like a project that needs perfecting. You start treating it like a partner. You ask it what it needs. You rest when it's tired. You move when it's stiff. You nourish it without shame. You stop assigning moral value to food, to rest, to how much you accomplish. You realize now that your body is not just a vessel, it's a messenger. And when you stop fighting it, you start hearing what it's been trying to say all along. You forgive differently too. You stop thinking forgiveness means pretending nothing happened. You stop forcing closure. You understand now that forgiveness is a process, not a one-time decision. You forgive not because they deserve it. You love more intentionally. You stop giving your heart to people who only know how to take. You look for reciprocity, not perfection. You want the kind of love that holds space, that listens deeply, that meets you where you are. You no longer accept crumbs. You wait for the feast. And if it doesn't come from others, you prepare it for yourself. You set your own table. You light your own candles. You romance your own spirit. Because love, real love, begins with how you treat yourself when no one else is watching. You embrace slowness in a world that worships speed. You don't rush healing. You don't rush decisions. You stop chasing timelines that were never yours to begin with. You understand now that slow doesn't mean stagnant. It means deliberate. It means mindful. It means you're not just surviving, you're savoring. And in that savoring, you find something you'd been missing all along. The simple miracle of being alive, of feeling your breath, of hearing your own laughter, of standing in the sunlight and knowing it touches you just as tenderly as it does everyone else. And in the quiet of your growth, you begin to notice something extraordinary. Your own voice, not the one shaped by fear or the one softened by expectation, but the raw, unfiltered, divine voice that has lived in your chest since the beginning. You hear it when you pause before saying yes, when you walk away from things that look good but feel wrong, when you choose rest even when your inner critic whispers, you haven't earned it. This voice doesn't scream, it doesn't beg, it simply speaks. And the more you listen, the clearer it becomes. You stop needing every season to be filled with transformation. You allow some seasons to be for integration, for rest, for reflection. You no longer pressure yourself to constantly evolve. You know now that stillness is just as sacred as movement, that sometimes the greatest changes happen beneath the surface, that silence can be just as holy as sound. You learn to sit in the in-between, in the pause between breaths, and find presence there, peace there, purpose there. You begin to understand that your life is not behind schedule, that the detours weren't mistakes, that every moment of confusion was a seed being planted in the soil of your becoming. You stop blaming yourself for what you didn't know. You stop regretting the paths that didn't lead where you hoped. You trust now that everything, every heartbreak, every dead end, every silence was part of the symphony. And even if you can't hear the melody just yet, you believe in the music. And maybe that's what all of this has been about. Not perfection, not performance, but presence. To arrive fully, to love deeply, to live honestly, to walk gently through your own story with open hands, knowing that what is meant for you will never require you to betray yourself to keep it. There's a gentle reckoning that begins to happen when you stop needing life to look a certain way and instead choose to feel your way through it. You don't wake up with the same urgency that used to drive you. You're no longer chasing a version of success crafted from someone else's blueprint. Instead, you're learning to trust the blueprint that's unfolding inside you, one moment at a time. You start asking yourself different questions. Does this feel like truth? Does this feel like freedom? You stop pushing toward destinations that once looked shiny in the distance, but feel hollow when held up close. You want depth now, honesty, something that doesn't just sparkle, but sustains. You begin noticing how much of your old life was built on pleasing others. How many choices were made not from alignment, but from fear. Fear of not being accepted, fear of being left, fear of standing out too much or not enough. You remember all the times you said yes when your soul whispered no, all the times you laughed when your heart wanted to cry, all the times you dimmed your light to make someone else feel more comfortable. And slowly, with quiet courage, you stop. Not out of rebellion, but out of reverence. Reverence for your own truth. Reverence for your own aliveness. You no longer wait for validation before honoring your intuition. You used to second-guess yourself, needing someone to confirm what you already knew. But now you understand that your body speaks in subtle, sacred ways. You feel it in the tension in your shoulders, in the shift in your breath, in the heaviness that sits behind your eyes. You start paying attention. You start responding with softness instead of suspicion. You don't need evidence to trust your inner knowing anymore. You just listen, you just act, because peace no longer needs proof. You start finding magic in the mundane. The way sunlight falls through the window and lands on your coffee mug. The way your heartbeat softens when you take a full breath. The way music feels different when you're fully present. You realize that life isn't happening in the miles. You wear clothes that feel like freedom, not restriction. You treat your body as a home, not a problem to fix. And slowly it starts to trust you again. You start becoming intentional about joy. You don't wait for it to find you. You create it. You let yourself laugh at things that used to make you feel too serious. You dance in the kitchen even when the world feels heavy. You find comfort in a cup of tea, in the pages of a good book, in watching birds from your window. You make joy a practice, not a prize. Something you cultivate, not something you wait to deserve. And in doing so, you stop asking permission to feel good. You allow joy to sit beside your sorrow. You stop believing you have to choose one or the other. You understand now that letting go isn't always about removing people from your life. It's about releasing expectations. It's about detaching from the fantasy of who someone could be and seeing who they actually are. It's about accepting that closure doesn't always come in words, that sometimes it comes in silence, in distance, in peace. You stop needing the last word. You stop needing validation to move on. You move on quietly, gently, with love. You bless what was, and you make room for what will be. You speak more gently to yourself now. You stop using shame as motivation. You stop calling yourself names when you slip. You say, it's okay. You're learning. You say, we'll try again tomorrow. You understand that real transformation doesn't come through force. It comes through love, through repetition, through patience. You are kinder to your mind. You forgive your forgetfulness. You hold your fears like a mother holds a crying child, with understanding, with softness, with presence. And when the storms come, as they always do, you no longer brace yourself in terror. You breathe. You remember all the times you survived before. You remember the ways you were held, even when you thought you were alone. You remember that storms pass, that emotions move, that darkness ends. And while you don't welcome the storm, you no longer resist it. You let it do its work. You let it wash you clean. And when it's over, you plant again. You always plant again. You have stopped waiting to be chosen because you've finally chosen yourself. And in doing so, you've built a life that doesn't depend on someone else showing up. You've built a sanctuary inside yourself, a place where you are always enough, always welcome, always home. Eventually, you begin to understand that wholeness was never about fixing yourself, that it was never about collecting tools, lessons, and self-help steps until you became someone entirely new. Wholeness, you realize, was about remembering, about peeling back the layers of survival, of societal expectations, of generational fear, to return to the soft, grounded self that was always buried beneath the noise. The version of you that didn't need to be improved, just witnessed, just loved, just allowed. And in that remembering, you no longer hustle to become. You rest into being. You rest into yourself. You stop needing to feel good all the time. You stop chasing happiness like a high. You allow space for neutrality, for days that feel numb, for mornings that feel still and uneventful. You understand now that life isn't meant to be a constant chase for joy. Sometimes it's just meant to be lived, observed, felt, without labeling every emotion as good or bad. You let things be without editing them in real time. You trust that your worth doesn't fluctuate with your moods, that some of the most important days are the ones that feel the most uneventful. Because in those days, you are breathing, choosing, living. You begin to connect with others in a new way, not from performance, not from fear, but from truth. You show up without your armor, without the mask of perfection, and though it feels risky, it feels free. You let people see you, even if they don't understand you. You let yourself be loved without needing to prove your worth first. You receive without guilt. You accept without apology. You allow kindness to land. You don't over-explain your past. You don't overcompensate for your softness. You let your presence be your offering, and you let their response be theirs to hold. You stop fearing the quiet in relationships. You no longer interpret silence as rejection. You allow space. You don't demand constant access. You trust the connection enough to breathe. You stop mistaking over-communication for closeness. You trust the ebb and flow. You give room for each person to return to themselves, because you've learned that the deepest love doesn't cling. It supports. It doesn't demand. It invites. And when the love is real, it doesn't disappear in the silence. It deepens. You've stopped performing for God. You no longer approach your spirituality with shame or checklist prayers. You sit with the divine like you sit with a trusted friend. You cry when you need to. You rage when it hurts.